last week we covered a very large swath of history. We basically talked about the Treaty of Versailles and how it impacted Germany very negatively, and now we're going to talk about the history of Germany until the entry into politics of Adolf Hitler. Then we're going to talk about Adolf Hitler's early life and the start of his career. So, if you recall, the Weimar Republic was proclaimed on November 9th, 1918, just 2 days before the end of the war, under Fri Apr as the Social Democratic president. So, Hitler would use this, the army would use this as the legacy of the November criminals, so that the legend that the army didn't actually lose the war, and that it was the cause of traitors, primarily the Jews, that caused the Germans to lose the war, and therefore Hitler would use this to promulgate anti-Semitic policies. Now, the Social Democrats were left-wing trade unionists, so they were socialists, but at the same time, and even further to the left, the Spartacist League under Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht proclaimed a Soviet republic, so communists, basically. And so these two dueling powers would eventually enter into a quasi-civil war. It wasn't outright fighting, but there were a lot of small clashes. So Germany basically was in a period of civil war. So at this point in time, Ebert received a call from General Groener, who was the head of the army, and he made a private pact with the army that the army would support the republic if the republic would let the army do everything their own way. Okay, so this basically gave the army specifically the generals and officer class, who are, if you recall, they were Prussian aristocrats, most of them. So this allowed them to continue doing what they had been doing the entire time, and they would eventually work behind the scenes to undercut the government. They eventually would collaborate with Hitler to undermine the government and make Hitler the chancellor. They thought they could control him, but he actually was playing them the entire time. So this is really the beginning of the end of the Republic, really a day or two into the Republic. So you can see the genesis of the fall. So getting back to 1918, so the Spartacists did actually gain some power until Ebert appealed to the army for help. So between January 10th and 17th, 1919, was called Bloody Week. Regular and Free Corps troops put down the Spartacists, and they killed Luxemburg and Liebknecht, so they got rid of the Soviet Republic around Berlin. Now there was a Soviet Republic around Bavaria that was to get put down also, which was also around the time that Adolf Hitler got involved in politics in Munich. So we talked about freebooters. So what are freebooters? So essentially soldiers would come back from the war, they were unemployed, and they had no jobs to come back to. So what they did was they would gather in bands. They would essentially go around robbing and killing, but they would organize themselves based on their political bent. So there were a lot of soldiers that would work for conservative forces, such as the Free Corps and Stahlhelm, which were steel helmets. That's what Stahlhelm means. A lot of these guys would eventually enter the SA under the Nazis. Okay, there were also people that organized as communist elements, such as the Red Guards. So there would be constant violence in German cities, really until the Nazis took over. Every election was accompanied by a lot of physical altercations. The first elections were called on January 19th, 1919. So the Social Democrats got 14 million votes, which is 185 out of 421 seats in the Reichstag, so they got a large percentage. The Center and Catholic parties got 166 seats, and the Conservatives and Monarchist parties got 85 seats. Even though they only got 85 seats, and it seems like they'd be a very small element, the conservative forces in the parliament would still work very powerfully to consistently undermine what the Republic was trying to do, and again would eventually collaborate with Adolf Hitler to bring down the Weimar Republic. So at the beginning, Parliament passed what at that point in time was the most liberal and democratic constitution of the 20th century. They borrowed from all other models, such as the American one and the British one, to come up with what they thought was the most humanistic document possible. Now, this would be the first 6 months. If you recall, on January 28, 1919, the Versailles Treaty was signed. So this really broke the Parliament in two. Conservatives rejected the treaty and the Parliament, and the army began to circumvent the treaty right away. So they began training right away. They were supposed to keep at 100,000. They did not. They organized units called the Black Reichswehr, which basically they were secret troops. They were actually trained by the army. So they always were, they never actually listened to Versailles. So the army was always much more active and much more powerful than it was meant to be. And as well, the judiciary, so all the judges were not changed, and they would remain extremely biased towards conservative causes throughout the entire history of the Republic. As we're going to see soon, we're going to talk about some of the things that they did. But basically, a lot of people were saying, this is our chance to get rid of conservative elements. We should make everything democratic. They did not do that, and therefore they basically set up the Weimar Republic for failure. Now, March 13th, 1920, there was what was known as the Kapp Putsch. So, a putsch is really a coup in Germany. Anybody know what a coup is? Yeah, it's a rebellion to take over power. Coup is French, putsch is in German. So this was Free Corps troops, so conservative troops. They installed this, he was a right-wing, I think he was a newspaperman actually, as chancellor, and the army didn't want that to happen, so they put down this rebellion. And 705 people were charged with treason, and only one person was actually sentenced. And he was sentenced to 5 years of honorary confinement. Okay, so this is a right-wing rebellion.
What does that mean?
What do you mean?
Honorary confinement.
Meaning like house arrest, but he can do whatever he wants, kind of thing. It's not really anything. That's the whole. Yeah, that's the whole point. The general that organized this putsch, he ran away to Hungary. When he came back, the army paid him for the 5 years that he ran away. Okay, so you see that there was no real consequence to be a right-wing, extreme right-wing conservative figure and try and take over the country. The opposite, liberals were actually treated extremely harshly, were sentenced to long prison terms for even mundane things like criticizing the army. Okay, so you can see that not doing anything to the judiciary was a major problem, as we're going to see in the trial of Adolf Hitler also worked in a large way to allow him to augment his standing as a political figure. So not only did there were right-wing coups, right-wing elements also carried out assassinations. They carried out many assassinations. According to some estimates, over 350 people were assassinated for political reasons. So this isn't even just fighting between conservative elements and communists. This is really just, they were politicians and they were killed just because they were monarchists, and the army really considered to be good policies for Germany. So some of the most famous, Matthias Erzberger, okay, the assassin was actually smuggled out of the country with help from the army and conservative elements. And Walter Rathenau in 1922, he was Jewish. He was the foreign minister of the Weimar Republic. And the assassin was given 15 years but released after 5. Now, it was interesting, just as a side note, Walter Rathenau thought that the best way to end anti-Semitism was total assimilation. Okay, so there was a large thrust from German assimilated Jews that the best thing to do is to assimilate. There was a large movement against Ostjuden, which even in the war happened in Western countries when Jews would come from places in the East like Poland and Russia, and it's interesting that most of these Jews would be frum, okay? They were poor, so they were most likely to be frum as well. The Western assimilated Jews, or Western Jews with money and power, wanted to disown these Jews and said, we're different, we are not like them. You should get rid of them because we agree that they're not good for the country, but we're different. We're going to look at in France, they basically begged Marshal Pétain, we're Frenchmen first, this is our homeland, expel the Jews that came here late, past a certain point, but we're okay. And it's very interesting that even within the Jewish community, we weren't able to get along and work together to try and come up with something to help ourselves, really. So back to Germany, to pay for war reparations. This is an economics lesson, if anybody's interested. Actually has current implications as well. So to pay for the really high war reparations, Germany decided to print more currency. Okay? So they'd have more money to pay. However, the more paper money in circulation, the less value your paper money has. Okay? So this led to what is known as hyperinflation. Okay, so in 1922, the mark fell to 400 marks to $1. Okay?
What does it gain you to do that?
Well, they basically, so what they were trying to do was they actually wanted just to have more currency just to pay it back. Okay, so it was such a large number, so they think we'll pay more money and just get it over with. It's actually interesting because the industrialists, when it started to fall, a lot of powerful industrialists used this basically worthless money to pay back their debt, and it allowed them to be debt-free when the recovery came, and this allowed Germany to actually rearm very quickly. So it was extremely short-sighted, but what they were trying to do was quickly pay back the debt. Now, Germany eventually said this, we can't go on with this, inflation's too much, so they requested a moratorium on payments. So they wanted to stop having to pay reparations for a while. The French said no, and as punishment they occupied the Ruhr, which is basically the coal-producing and steel-producing territory of Germany. So once they occupied it, they took it for themselves, basically meaning that Germany had very little industry left. Okay, people went on strike in the Ruhr, people went on strike all over Germany, and the French retaliated by hanging people for not working. Okay, so things are starting to spin out of control. Inflation increases. By August 1st, it took 1 billion marks to buy $1. Okay? So the problem with this thing is that people who have savings, right, their savings, say, are worth $150,000, 150,000 marks, but now, the more inflation goes up, the less your savings are worth. So your savings shrink to nothing. Okay? And people's wages also became useless. It's called lack of purchasing power. Okay? So people were wiped out. I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of this time. It's basically like people going to buy bread with like a wheelbarrow of money. I mean, it's kind of humorous to think about it, but at the same time, think how scary it is when, you know, you get I don't know if any of your family has ever been to Turkey or Italy. It's like 1 million, you know, they come home with like a 1 million lira bill or something. It's worth like 13 cents. And that's the same kind of thing. It happened, actually now, it's like that in Zimbabwe. It's like $9 trillion for like a can of soup. Yeah, something, exactly, right. What is that?
Zimbabwe.
How much is it? 10 million? Yeah, was it worth like 2 cents? Yeah, so that's the kind of thing that was happening. People would show up with tons of these, and it wouldn't do them anything. And actually, that's what everybody is afraid of in America today, because they're printing so much money to pay back the debt, and everybody's very afraid that inflation is going to rise and people's savings are going to be severely diminished.
Isn't that what it's doing right now?
What?
Isn't that how it is right now?
Yeah, that's what's happening right now. That's what everybody's afraid of. That's why everybody doesn't like America's monetary policy.
Well,
I hope you don't have any American money from your bar mitzvah. Okay, so by November 1922, the rate was 4 billion to 1, and then eventually went into the trillions. Okay, so we already mentioned that industrialists took advantage of this to pay back their debt with worthless marks. They got their debt paid off, and when Germany recovered again, we're going to see in 1924, 1925, the Dawes Plan, when the U.S. started giving the Germans money. They were able to use this money. They didn't have to pay back their debt anymore, and they could use it directly to rearm Germany, which made them a very powerful army in the 1930s. In this climate, okay, you can understand that people were miserable, people were hungry, people were extremely angry, they had no faith in their government, and they were looking for a scapegoat and a leader, and therefore enter a young politician named Adolf Hitler. Okay? So now, let's look at the man known as Hitler. So, he was born at 6:30 on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn. Okay, so that's in Austria, and it's right next to the Bavarian border. Okay, so Bavaria is in southern Germany. The capital of Bavaria is Munich. So from the beginning, his entire life, Hitler was obsessed with uniting the German-speaking peoples of Austria and Germany, and eventually places outside of there. So Mein Kampf actually starts where Hitler says, "It's providential that my birthplace should be this little town on the border that we have made our life's work to reunite by all means at our disposal." So central to his life's work and his goals at the beginning anyway was really just to unite the German-speaking peoples into one powerful entity. So he was the third child in the third marriage of a man who until 39 was known as Alois Schicklgruber. Okay, so that's where all the stuff about his name comes from. This was his father's mother's name, okay, Hitler's grandmother, because he was an illegitimate son. He was not actually claimed by anybody. Okay, so back then people had to claim fatherhood, or else the child was known as illegitimate, born out of wedlock. So until he was 39, his father hadn't shown up. So everybody said he was an illegitimate child. Eventually, this 84-year-old guy named Johann Georg Heidler showed up. He was a wandering miller. He wandered around from town to town. He claimed him as his son. Okay? So this is really what happened. Heidler had many different permutations that in the family had. It was Heidler or Hitler, and eventually Hitler. Okay? So Adolf Hitler would choose that. He said that he liked the way it sounded. Okay? It sounded harder than Heidler, but less harsh than Hitler. Okay, also, so this is also where the debate comes when people talk about would Hitler have had the same appeal if his name was Schicklgruber. Okay, I don't really... It's true, I have heard people say that before. That they wonder what would have happened had his name been different. Unfortunately, it was not, so we can't really deal with that. But that's where it came from. Okay? He would fight his father at age 11. His father was a civil servant, a very low-end civil servant, wanted him to go into the civil service. He rebelled. He really didn't want to. He wanted to be an artist. At one point he said he even thought of being a priest. Most of this is from his autobiographical stuff in Mein Kampf. Also, a little bit from, he really only had one friend when he was growing up. His name was August Kubizek. He really was, we'll talk about it, he wasn't really much of a friendly guy. He scored well in grade school, not really so well in high school. Hitler actually felt a lot of anger towards his teachers, even in later life. He kept mentioning it, even when, it's very interesting. So this is one quote, there I saw about 5 or 6. When I think of the men who were my teachers, I realize most of them were slightly insane. It's tragic that such people have power to bar a young man's way. Okay, this was March 3rd, 1942. And this was already after, this was around Stalingrad. Okay, so you'd think he'd have a lot more important things to do than sit around complaining about his high school teachers. But something that would repeat itself again and again is Hitler, in his own private life, often when he wasn't dealing with strategy and he just had his own circle around him, he liked to tell stories that he had told over and over and over again, and they all had to sit through it like until he fell asleep, kind of thing, and nobody could tell him otherwise. It's really interesting to think about what the people had to sit through. Didn't seem like kind of that interesting a man in his normal conversation, because he didn't really have many friends. Now, he had to drop out of high school due to a lung ailment, so he stayed home. His father had died at this point, but despite the fact that his mother was a widow, he didn't seek out regular employment. He preferred to stay home and really rejoice in being a guy taken care of by his mother. This would be as a common theme throughout his life. He never actually would get regular employment. Now, he was already a fanatical German nationalist at 16. Okay, so again, some things about uniting Austria and Germany. He was, in fact, a voracious reader. Everybody would comment about how he would read a ton. So what he read when he was younger was mostly German history and mythology, and it would play a recurring role in his approach to problems. Yes?
He was Austrian though, right?
Yes, he was. But he was obsessed with uniting Germany. Okay, so he felt that German-speaking peoples were really one.
Even though he was not.
Well, he felt that he was German.
He's on the border.
Like, isn't that ironic that the king of we're better than you are was not actually one of them? Like,
yes, it's also
with blonde hair, blue eyes.
Yes, it's also interesting. Yes, that he talked about the Teutonic Superman, who was a tall, blonde-haired, blue eyes, and he was short, brown hair and brown eyes. Yes, it was very interesting. But a lot of Nazis, a lot of higher level Nazis did not look
like him. Yeah, most pictures like Heinrich Himmler and all those guys all had brown hair and brown eyes.
Well, except Reinhard Heydrich. He was not a very nice man. He was the head of the SD until Sicherheitsdienst. It means security service, but basically the first 3 major concentration camps, Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor, were run by him. They were called Operation Reinhard camps.
Were they as bad back then? No.
Were they? What do you mean?
They weren't as bad like Auschwitz, for example.
There are, I think, less than 100 documented survivors from any of those 3 camps.
How many people went in?
Oh, 1.5 million.
Whoa.
Yeah, so they actually worked a different way.
How do they work?
They were more carbon monoxide as opposed to Zyklon B.
Same goal, same achievement.
Yes, the same goal, but it was more effective to use Zyklon B. You know what Zyklon B is, right? Prussic acid. Okay, so we'll talk about it later. But anyway, the poison that they used in Auschwitz, okay, it's rat poison, essentially. It's hydrogen cyanide, okay, and that works. If it works the way cyanide works, it works by inhibiting aerobic respiration. You know what that is?
Breathing.
No, aerobic respiration is your cell metabolizes glucose, right, for energy. Okay, so there are 2 different ways to do that: anaerobic glycolysis, okay, and aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration provides most of your energy, so cyanide interrupts that. It interrupts the electron transport chain. Any of you guys doing biology?
Yeah.
You know what the electron transport chain is? Are you holding up? No, there is a poison that does that, but that's not what it is. Anyway, so hydrogen cyanide stops that. It's much more effective. Okay. So Chelmno was the first real concentration camp where they killed somebody. Actually, they killed people now. Anyway, they used carbon monoxide. In Chelmno, they had gas vans. Okay, so they would stuff people into a van. They'd run the gas. You know how people commit suicide now? So that's what they did. They hooked up the exhaust into the truck, and they drove around with them. They drove around with them until they were dead.
And what about the people driving?
What? It was into the back of the car, not into the cab. It didn't into the back of the truck. You're right. It doesn't seem like it was so safe for the person in front. Either way, carbon monoxide takes a lot longer. Okay, it impairs your hemoglobin transport. Okay, if any of you guys are doing anything related to biology.
Yeah.
Anyway, it takes a lot longer and it's a lot more ineffective. So the Operation Reinhardt camps worked with carbon monoxide poisoning. They had enormous engines, and they would have a guy pumping the gas essentially until everybody was dead. So, I don't know how I got onto that.
Wait, why did they shoot people again?
They did. They did, but it was simpler to use. It was simpler because it had less of an effect on the people doing it.
What type of effect did? This is horribly sadistic, but why not line the Jews up in rows of like 10,000, take it like one of those war machine guns and shoot them down?
They did do that in places because they thought it was having a bad psychological effect on the people doing it. They didn't think it was quick enough. They didn't think it was clean enough.
Why did they put them all into a camp and then bomb it? That's really bad.
And there's no mental
guarantee you
I don't know. That's not really. This was actually much more effective than that.
Bomb? You're not guaranteed to kill anyone.
The Germans bombed London for a long time. They didn't kill 6 million people. Anyway, so Hitler would be informed by what he read. He was obsessed with Richard Wagner, who was a preeminent German composer. He was also an immense anti-Semite. But he would, so Hitler's obsession with German mythology would play out. There's a story called Götterdämmerung, which means Twilight of the Gods, where Wotan, who is one of the Norse gods, he basically burns down Valhalla, which is heaven, and everybody with him. So he takes everybody with him, and when Hitler was in his final days, that's really how he looked at it. He would say that Germany wasn't good enough for him, and that they all deserved to die with him. Okay, so he kept that going. So you can see that he was informed by his younger. Now he left to Vienna. He lived in Linz, which was still closer to the German border. He left to Vienna. He applied to the Academy of Fine Arts. He wanted to be an artist. He got rejected 2 years in a row. They told him to apply for architecture, but he never did. But he would become very interested in architecture. It would also, in later life, Albert Speer, who would become his architect. They designed many things together. They built a new Reichs-Chancellery. But Hitler often had plans to build an immense new capital in Berlin that would overshadow every other capital in the world. And he liked to often come back to these ideas even after they became really impossible when they were losing. So from 1909 to 1913, Hitler ran out of money. Okay, so because he would not seek steady employment, he decided to live in shelters and youth hostels, and he ate at soup kitchens. He had an immense fear of joining the proletariat, which is the working class. Okay, and he would exploit similar white-collar class sensibilities when building the Nazi party. Okay, so he would appeal to industrialists, because it's very interesting, right? It's a socialist party, but he wasn't actually a socialist. So what he did was he recruited the masses, but at the same time, he appealed to industrialists by saying, I don't actually believe that. Okay, so what he made money by, he would make money by painting postcards of famous Viennese landmarks, like St. Stephen's Cathedral. Okay, so that's how he made money, by like selling these little postcards. Now, at that point in time, we've talked about the Austrian Empire was coming to an end. So German speakers were beginning to lose power. There were three basic parties that Hitler followed: the Social Democrats, Christian Socialists, and Pan-German Nationalists. So he hated the Social Democrats, okay, for its hostile attitude toward the struggle for preservation of Germanism and its courting of the Slavic comrade. Okay, so he hated them for, he basically called them communists, and they weren't for the primacy of Germans. Okay, but he would take three major policies that he would apply later. So it's very interesting that he formed a lot of his political ideas when he was young. He didn't really change them.
How old was he at the time?
He's 1889, so he'd be 20. So his three major policies: one was to create a mass movement. So you had to have support of the masses. You had to have propaganda to activate the masses. And he understood the value of using spiritual and physical terror. So a quote was, "I understand the infamous terror used against the bourgeoisie, which can't withstand its attacks. At a given sign, it unleashes a veritable barrage of lies and slanders against whatever adversary deemed more dangerous. I achieved an equal understanding of the importance of using physical terror against the individuals and the masses." Okay, so this really is his own early account of what he believed to do as a political party, and he would actually carry these out later when a lot of the things he talked about were lies, when he talked about the reason why he invaded Poland. The famous story that he got the SS to dress up criminals, and he had them stage a fake attack on a radio station, and he said, "Oh, this is the last straw, and we have to go in." He said in Danzig, before they talked about how the Poles are killing people and raping our women, and we have to go in there. So basically what he said, he learned very young, it doesn't matter really what the truth is, just as long as you say something say something enough times and loud enough, people will listen to you. And you also have to back that up with physical terror. So you also have to back that up by the threat of physical violence. Okay? So you can see very young Hitler had formed political ideas. Now, he identified with the Pan-Germans due to anti-Semitism and anti-socialism, but he disagreed with their move against the churches. Okay? The Pan-German slogan was "away from Rome." And Hitler would not do that. In fact, the first really power to sign an agreement with Germany was in fact the Vatican. It was the first state to sign a political agreement with Hitler. It was signed by the Secretary of State for the Church at that time, who eventually became Pope Pius XII, who was the Pope during the war, who really didn't do anything, who they're now trying to make a saint. Yeah. Okay?
They made a bomb on the Nobel Peace Prize, so... Yeah, you can see that.
Yeah, but they...
I do the same thing.
Somewhat, yeah. So, right? Yeah, you know that's on camera, right? Good job. Yeah, exactly. Jeez. Anyway, so Hitler said he himself became an anti-Semite in Vienna, but his only friend, August Kubizek, come back to him again, claims that he was really anti-Semitic when he got there. But he said, when he got to Vienna, "I discovered the moral stain on this chosen people. Was there any form of filth, especially in cultural life, without at least one Jew? Cutting even cautiously into such an abscess, you find, like a maggot in a rotting body, a kike." Okay? So, hey, it's not me. Again, there was a lot of morbid sexuality in his writings, okay, as characteristic of Viennese press against the Jews, and eventually Der Stürmer, which we talked about. Anybody remember who wrote Der Stürmer?
Roger.
You gotta be kidding me. Julius Streicher, okay? So a lot of these writings against the Jews were sexual in nature, that the Jews defiled German virgins, and Hitler said he had this nightmare vision of seduction of 100,000 girls by these repulsive, crooked-legged Jew bastards. Okay? So a lot of what he wrote was against the Jews in a very, how would you say, vulgar and raw way. It's interesting to note that, yeah, it's very crude, but people like to suggest that Hitler was a deviant in that respect, but all evidence is to the contrary, that he really was just shy around women, and he was more prudish. He wasn't actually, people try and say that he was a deviant, but in fact all the evidence suggests that he was not. Despite that, however, a lot of his writings and a lot of Nazi writings at that time contained this element to it. Okay? So this is the end of Hitler in Vienna. In 1913, he left to Munich, and he entered the Bavarian army at the end of World War I. As mentioned, he would be decorated twice for bravery, so he won the Iron Cross second class and first class, which was very unique for the Imperial Army at that time. They usually did not decorate enlisted men with such a high honor. Okay? So it was obvious that Hitler had done acts of immense bravery. There is a legend that he basically got 15 Frenchmen to surrender at once. That's really unsubstantiated, but he did something, obviously. And he would really wear these decorations proudly until his death.
How old was he when he became a German citizen?
He became a German citizen much later. He became a German citizen.
He was a soldier before he was a citizen?
Correct. He had to petition to the King of Bavaria.
Oh, so he was still a Bavarian stuff?
No, he just had to petition. He just had to go and say, I want to fight with the Bavarian army as opposed to the Austro-Hungarian army. And they let him do it, yeah.
How was he citizen before or after he was
before, but after he was already a major political player. So we're going to see after the beer hall putsch, so he tried to do something we're going to talk about. So they tried to get him deported, the police, but they wouldn't do it, because he wasn't a citizen. So they tried to get rid of him, but
because he wasn't a citizen?
Correct, but the conservative elements, the right-wing people would not let him be deported. So soldiers found him odd. He would stay to himself. He always supported the war and the Kaiser, even when German soldiers really were against the war. He often engaged in attacks against the Jews and the Marxists. He accused the Jews of robbing the nation. We mentioned of his obsession with the stab-in-the-back legend and the November criminals, which would be widely believed in Germany after the war. So after the war, he comes back to Munich. There's a People's Republic led by a guy named Eisen, which was replaced by Soviet Republic after Eisen's assassination. And then that was replaced by a Free Corps and right-wing government after. Okay, so Bavaria, and specifically Munich, became a real breeding ground for people who were anti the Weimar Republic, such as Erich Ludendorff, who was former general quartermaster of the army. Okay, and people would plot assassinations out of there, some of the ones that we talked about. Now, Hitler joined the army on March 14th, 1920. He joined the political department. Apparently, he was named educational officer of his unit when a superior officer heard him engaging in an anti-Semitic attack on somebody that said the Jews weren't so bad. On September 19th, 1920, he was sent to check out the German Workers' Party. This is because the army was very worried that workers' parties were socialists and they wanted to get rid of the army power structure. Because in Russia, the first thing that they did was they elected their own officers. Okay, so the officer class did not want this to happen in Germany because they wanted to retain their power. Okay, he was given a pamphlet by a guy named Anton Drexler, who was by trade a locksmith, and he was told that he was accepted as a member of the German Workers' Party. So he didn't even ask to get in, but they gave it to him. He said that he deliberated on it, and after deliberation, he became the 7th member of the German Workers' Party. Another important member at this time was a guy named Ernst Röhm, who was a former captain in the Imperial Army, and he had ideas very much in line with Hitler. He would organize strong-arm units that eventually evolved into the SA. Okay, so the brown shirts, we're going to talk about them next week. So he was a very powerful figure. Now, Hitler took over head of propaganda. He dreamed very big. He organized what was their biggest meeting at the time was to be 2,000 people in the Hofbrauhaus. It's very interesting to note that in Germany, most of the political meetings actually happen in beer halls. And it's very interesting that all of their major political meetings happen in beer halls. So, yeah, a very interesting way to go about politics. So, he gave this speech on April 1st, 1920. He enunciated the 25 points of the German Workers' Party. They were to eventually become official Nazi policy. Some of them he would regret because they were socialist, such as the nationalization of trusts, profit sharing of industry with the state. This became very sticky for him when major industrialists were giving him money when he was coming to power in the late 1920s. He started to get a lot of money from major industrial groups, and he basically had to say, well, I'm not actually a socialist. But some of the other ones he would never reject, such as the unification of Germany, all his anti-Semitic ones, such as the barring of Jews from office and withdrawing their citizenship, and also the abrogation of the treaties of Versailles and Saint-Germain. Now, he also talked about the creation of a strong central state. Okay, so he basically talked about a fascist dictatorship, almost. Talked about the centrality of one power apparatus. Now, this is interesting. It shows that Hitler actually had very far-sighted thinking, because at that point in time in Bavaria, everybody wanted to leave the Weimar Republic and just be independent on their own. And there was there were major movements in Germany that were actually, let's just break up. Okay? But Hitler actually was not satisfied. He didn't want to just lead Bavaria, he wanted to lead all of Germany. And as we see from Mein Kampf, it wasn't all of Germany, it was all German-speaking peoples. Okay, so we had already, in 1920, he's part of a group that's maybe 100, 150 people, and he's already talking about taking over Germany. Okay, so he's an unbelievable personality. Not saying that he was a very nice person, that's rather obvious that he wasn't, but to understand the mind of Adolf Hitler is an unbelievable exercise. Now, October 5th, 1921, they organized the SA, which is the Sturmabteilung, which means stormtroopers. And so this is the first real use of the word stormtroopers. What? Yes, Star Wars stole it from them, yes. They were known as the brown shirts because that was their uniform. And we'll talk about how big they got in later Germany. They became enormous. But what they did was they would go around protecting Hitler's speeches and breaking up other speeches. Okay, Hitler once led them in an attack on another speech, and he got put in jail for a month because they beat up everybody. But he said it's okay because the guy didn't speak, so I don't care. Interestingly, he decided that the real way to ally a people was to choose a symbol. And what symbol did he choose? Yes, he chose a swastika.
What does that represent?
So I'm going to tell you in a second. But what? It's found in a whole bunch of places. It's found in ancient Greece. It's Hindu. It's very Eastern, but it's also there's old Slavic stuff. You should check out the Wikipedia page on the swastika. It's unbelievable how many different places it is. So, okay, it was known as the Hakenkreuz, which is the hooked cross. Okay? So, what he did was he adopted the imperial colors of Germany, but he didn't want to keep the imperial flag because he didn't actually want the monarchy to come back. He wanted him to take over everything. Okay? So he did something very smart. he used old German colors so German nationalists could ally to the flag, but he also used his own symbol that would basically say, don't go back to them, come back to me. Okay? So what the flag would stand for is the red is socialist. Okay? So that appeals to the working classes that he was trying to keep in there. Yes. The white is the nationalist ideal. And the swastika is the struggle for the victory of the Aryan man. Okay, so that is the specific Nazi part of that flag. Okay, so it really wasn't just the swastika, it was actually the entire flag that was in symbolism. And I don't know if you've seen any pictures, but a lot of their pageantry, they would have standards that were modeled on the ancient Roman standards, right? Okay, what was the Roman symbol?
Eagle?
Yes. What did the Germans take?
Bird?
The eagle. Okay, right? They would have slightly different.
Patriotic.
Slightly different. Anyway, so they would have a standard, right? The old Roman standard would have SPQR, right?
Yeah.
No, you guys know that?
Yeah.
You didn't watch Gladiator? Come on.
No.
SPQR.
I don't watch it.
It's, when he scratches it off his arm, exactly. So, okay, so SPQR, so the... Huh? Excuse me? And the Germans, the Nazis would replace that with NSDAP, which are the German initials for German National Socialist Workers' Party. National Deutsche Arbeit Party. So, now we get to the beer hall putsch, okay? So, I'll be quick. In 1923, the Republic decided to resume paying again and to stop the resistance in the Ruhr, so everybody got really angry. Hitler feared that Bavaria was going to declare itself independent, so what he decided to do was to take over Bavaria and then march on Berlin. Okay, so he figured the time has come. Okay, so he heard that there was a meeting of the 3 Bavarian heads of government, which was the president, the chancellor, and the head of the army, I believe, at the Bürgerbrau Keller. Okay, so this is another beer hall. Yes. Well, it's not really a bar. It's enough room for like 5,000 people, so it's not really. I don't know if that qualifies as a bar anymore.
Big bar, wedding hall.
Well, that's where Oktoberfest happens, right? Oktoberfest happens in Munich. Yes, think about it. Okay, so Hitler had the SS surround the building. What he did was he came in, he fired a revolver in the air and declared that the national revolution has begun. Now, and he said that the 3 leaders, you have to come with me in a private room. He told them, come with me and we'll take over Bavaria, we'll go to Berlin. They refused. So what he did was he went out to the crowd and he told a very big lie. He said that they had agreed and that everything was okay and that they were now going to, there was a revolution, they were going to take over. The crowd started cheering, so the 3 guys heard that and they're like, okay, we agree. At that point in time, Ludendorff showed up, so this was calculated. Excuse me?
Why don't you guys say that they argued him?
Well, because he said that he'd shoot them. Slight, yeah. Okay, so hold on. So they didn't really agree. Okay, so Ludendorff showed up. It was calculated. Hitler had used him to get. He hoped that the army would support him. So then Hitler left, and he left Ludendorff in charge. The 3 guys said, we need to leave to organize things. Ludendorff said, I have to trust the word of a German officer. He let them all go. And of course they left and decided to turn the army against him. Okay? So when Hitler came back, he realized that nothing had happened and that everything was beginning to go wrong. And Ludendorff said, our only plan is to march to the center of the city. He was still famous, right? So he said, they're not going to shoot me. We can go through, we can take over, at least we can take over Munich. So at 11 o'clock, 3,000 SA, they left the hall, and they marched arm in arm, linked, until they met a detachment of police. They each didn't want to fire at each other because most of them were former army. But at some point in time, somebody did start shooting, okay? And basically all the Nazis ran away. Hitler had his arm dislocated because he was holding onto another guy really tightly. At the end of the day, 16 Nazis were killed, and all of the Nazis all the leaders except Göring, and I think Hess. Göring was actually treated by a Jewish guy and smuggled to Austria, which helped in the end. But so Hitler was arrested. So you would think that this would be the end of the Nazi Party, right? Because they tried to have a revolution and it didn't work. So that indeed was not the case. He was put on trial for treason on February 26, 1924. Instead of ending his career, it made him a world-renowned figure. So he was actually, conservative people rigged it that he would have an easy judge. He was allowed to cross-examine witnesses and interrupt whenever he wanted. You have to remember he's a defendant, okay? And he was allowed to say whatever he wanted. His opening statement was 4 hours long. He liked to talk. He was absolutely unapologetic, saying there's no high treason against the traitors of 1918. So he basically said, right, everything is run by Jews and traitors, and I'm going to take it over. Okay? He said that it wasn't the army's fault. He basically worked to woo the army. He said that I'm not going to make the same mistake next time. I'm going to have the army with me. Okay? So what happened was, instead of being really this crime for treason really had a life sentence, he got 5 years, and hold on one second, the judges actually wanted to make it less, but they assured him that he'd be out in 6 months. He was out in 9 months.
What year was it?
1924. Okay, so this is really when the German at its lowest. Okay,
How old was he?
he was 35. 35. In prison, he wrote a book. Yes, he wrote Mein Kampf. He actually it was actually a much longer title. It was like 4 years of tyranny and torture. It was like a really long title, but his publisher changed it, actually. So he set down his ideas in rambling form. My struggle.
Yes, he didn't actually write it, someone else wrote it.
No, well, he dictated it. He wrote it. Okay, he didn't physically write it. It wasn't like a ghost writer, okay? So even actually Nazis thought that it was unreadable. It sold under 10,000 copies each year until he rose to power, and then sold many copies, culminating in over 6 million sold in the year 1940. He expounded on his main ideas there, primarily Lebensraum, which is going to come up again and again and again, which means living space, which Hitler said Germans need room to live and grow organically, and that can only happen in the East. So he basically said there, we're going to take Russia's land. We're going to take Russian people's land, and they're going to be subservient to us, and we're going to get their land. Okay? He also railed against Bolshevism and anti-Semitism. Most of the quotes, well, a lot of the quotes that you would hear from Hitler a lot of them would be from Mein Kampf, but he would finish them up in a lot of speeches. He wrote a prelude to the Nuremberg laws there. He lamented the loss of blood purity by intermarriage. And he wrote heavily on the concept of dictatorship and the all-powerful state. And he would follow through on all these ideas. And it's really tragic that people didn't take him seriously, because even when he was rising to power, people would say, no, he didn't mean it, he's changing his mind. And really, he followed through on everything he wrote there. Okay, so you can see that even in 1924, he had the beginnings of what would become the Nazi state. So next week, we'll talk about the actual political rise of the